Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week we return to Barton Cottage with Chapter 8 and onward of Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, and we'll try to push through to the end of the volume, though I will tell you right now that we will not, in fact, make it all the way to the end of the volume. It's my scheduling technique. My scheduling practice really is one of high optimism and then last-minute enforced practicality. That's really how this whole thing is going to work out. I'm mediating between my own sense and sensibility with every episode of this new podcast venture. We're going to try to make it to the end of 15 tonight, possibly 14 tonight. I think we'll see how we go, but then we'll be able to accelerate a little bit from here because there's some really complex and interesting stuff in the chapters that we're going to cover this week that I didn't want to skip right over. I wanted to, take our time. This is always the tension. On the one hand, I want to cover as many books as possible, and on the other, I'm very well aware as we sit down to record each new episode of Stars and Swords that we shall not pass this way again, that it's very unlikely I'm ever going to do another podcast series on Sense and Sensibility. So I feel obligated, burdened to say everything that there is to say in each episode. And I'm rapidly moving through this book, even at this pace. So we'll see how we go. No one, I'm sure, is going to mind an extra week or two at the far end. Speaking of things that are upcoming here on Stars and Swords, I wanted to call out an opportunity for you all to get involved and for you all to tell me what it is that you would like to see over the course of the next few weeks, because I really want to do some bonus episodes around Sense and Sensibility. I really want to discuss, of course, the 1995 feature film by Ang Lee, which is so good, is just so good. And then the 2008 Andrew Davis BBC TV adaptation, which I believe is a 3-part adaptation. And I'm just not sure of the best way to do it. I'm not sure if a lecture format approach is what you guys want. These will, whatever form they take, probably be bonus episodes over on the Patreon page, patreon.com/nextword. But I can do lecture-style episodes about them. We can do more like these seminar sessions, kind of exploring it together, just here live on YouTube. Or we could try something over on the Discord, either some kind of live communal commentary track via text in the Discord, or some kind of live interactive voice thing on the Discord where we could all of us who want to join in, zip into the voice channel there and have a conference call, I guess. The problem with that is that it's harder to record, but there would be challenges to overcome. But I'm sure that we can manage it. So if you have any strong preferences or any ideals or anything that you particularly don't want because it doesn't suit the way that you listen to the podcast or the way that you engage with Stars and Swords, please let me know in the days to come. starsandswordspod@gmail.com or starsandswordspod in all the usual social media places. I am joined this evening by Glad Rebecca. I'm joined this evening by Elizabeth, who hardly ever gets to hang out for these live sessions because, well, the world of the cocktail drinking elite here in our small town in Oklahoma really need her on a Thursday night. Let's get into our discussion here. Last week we were introduced, of course, to our core cast. Most of our core cast. Anyway, we followed Elinor, Marianne, and their mother to Barton Park in Devonshire, where we meet Sir John Middleton, his lady wife, the gossipy and intrusive Mrs. Jennings, and Colonel Brandon, who quietly demonstrates a sincere, genteel, if somewhat unenthusiastic appreciation for Marianne's skills at pianoforte, and by extension, Marianne herself. We are going to jump into Chapter 8 tonight with Mrs. Jennings figuring it all out. Mrs. Jennings was a widow with an ample jointure. She had only 2 daughters, both of whom she had lived to see respectably married, and she now, therefore, had nothing to do but marry all the rest of the world. In the promotion of this object, she was zealously active as far as her ability reached, and missed no opportunity of projecting weddings among all the young people of her acquaintance. She was remarkably quick in the discovery of attachments, and had enjoyed the advantage of raising the blushes and vanity of many a young lady by insinuations of her power over such a young man. And this kind of discernment enabled her, soon after her arrival at Barton, decisively to pronounce that Colonel Brandon was very much in love with Marianne Dashwood. She rather suspected it to be so on the very first evening of their being together, from his listening so attentively while she sang to them. And when the visit was returned by the Middletons dining at the cottage, the fact was ascertained by his listening to her again. It must be so. She was perfectly convinced of it. It would be an excellent match, for he was rich and she was handsome. Mrs. Jennings had been anxious to see Colonel Brandon well married ever since her connection with Sir John first brought him to her knowledge. She was always anxious to get a good husband for every pretty girl. I mean, what more could people want? I mean, perhaps this could be expanded into the first line of a much more famous and much more influential Jane Austen novel. But, for now, let it just be said that she was always anxious to get a good husband for every pretty girl. And, of course, vice versa. Just incidentally, it turns out that Handsome enters English in the 14th century, originally meaning easy to handle or ready at hand, right? Something that is literally handsome. It is suited to the hand. That comes in the 14th century, and it only becomes oriented toward the masculine, right? Our beauty standard of masculine attractiveness in the first half of the 20th century. Prior to that, it means attractive, well-formed, but without a gendered bias. Elizabeth says in the chat, I feel we're supposed to be more annoyed with Mrs. Jennings than I am. She's just such a delight to read. I will admit that last week I was very much team Mrs. Jennings, excuse me. This week I am much less so. This week I find her to be much more strident in her selfishness, right? In the way that gossips can be kind of democratically inclined, right? Gossips can be interested in the world around them and not an active part of that. But I think that we see this week a turning here. And yeah, I mean, she is engaging. That's always, of course, been Austen's greatest strength, is her ability to summon all of this voice and all of this presence, all of this personality, even in characters who get much less page time than Mrs. Jennings does. But I found myself really slipping with her this week. She dropped radically in my estimation from my really rather warm feelings of her in last week's reading, but we'll see how she progresses as we move through the reading. We spend the rest of this fairly brief chapter on the subject of Colonel Brandon's extreme antiquity, right? His awful aged condition, his flannel waistcoats, pausing at the end of the chapter long enough for Marianne to express some concerns to her mother about Edward's continued absence. Marianne complains about her sister's cool affect, foreshadowing her own emotional response much later in the book, right? She does this right at the end of the chapter. Quote, when is she dejected or melancholy? When does she try to avoid society or appear restless and dissatisfied in it? For all that these adventures through much of the first volume, it's really not until the very end of the first volume that we cinch these stories together, that we absolutely present a unified novel plot, right? And we'll remember that when Austen is writing, the novel is still a very young form. We haven't quite settled on all the conventions. We haven't quite settled on a really standardized way of approaching these plots. This episodic kind of storytelling is much more popular prior to the advent of the novel and continues to be so, obviously, all the way through the 19th century. You know, we're still talking about Dickens 80 years after Austen, and we're still talking about these episodic plots. But what happens toward the end of the first volume is that we do cinch these stories together. But up until that point, we're still, I think, unsure of exactly the trajectory of the novel. We sense, I believe, that there is a vulnerability to the Dashwoods in Barton Cottage. For all that they are, I just said college again, I cannot get my brain to wrap itself around Barton Cottage, so forgive me if I continually refer to their new home residence as Barton College. It's as frustrating to me as I'm sure it is to you. We can sense, though, I think, that all is not completely settled, that all is not completely right. I think that we are instructed very early in the novel to view both Elinor and Marianne as being somewhat unfinished, that they are somewhat, that they have a great deal of potential, but that potential is not being fully realized. And of course, that is the main thematic thrust, the main thematic arc of the book. But I really like how we suspend that through the first volume, and we don't really see those cracks appear until we apply pressure to them at the end of the first volume into the second volume. So with all of that said, let's skip through the very brief chapter 8 and move on to chapter 9. Skipa is also joining us in the chat this evening. Good to have you with me, Skipa. Thank you for being here. Galadra Becky asks, is Mrs. Jennings' major flaw gossip or being a busybody? That, I think, is exactly the question, right? When we're introduced to her, she is presented as an agent provocateur, right? She is presented as someone who is interestingly kind of dismissive of the rules of polite society. We're going to see that turn quite sharply, quite grimly when she is confronting Colonel Brandon in the pages to come. But that kind of disrespectful attitude is very fresh and it's very engaging and it is very comedic, and I think that's why we align with her immediately. But then we see this kind of predatory interest in everyone's lives, right? Having secured marriages for her daughter, she now wants to see the whole world married and will constantly gossip. You know, it's presented to us as a fun, lighthearted thing that she causes the ladies to blush, suggesting that they have the power over such and such a young man. But that is wildly intrusive, and she is embarrassing young women in a world that, God knows, severely undervalues young women. So how exactly the narrative presents her to us, how exactly Austen's narrative voice presents her to us, and how we understand her own conduct, well, I think that this is part of the main thematic kind of tangle, the main thematic Gordian knot at the heart of this book, which is secrets and secret keeping, right? The idea that information ought to be preserved, that it ought to be, if not concealed, then at least maintained with dignity, right? There is this idea of privacy, there is this idea of dignity, there is this idea of intimacy, that intimacy is so important. It's so important that you can form a bond with someone and share your soul, share your secrets with that person. But when that process is publicized, when it is made tawdry, when it is made sport for the entertainment of everyone there gathered, I think that we are leaving the path of judgment. I will say, in aggregate, across the course of this book, I think that this is true of all of our major players here. In later books, Austen is going to give us villains. Austen is going to give us really odious, awful people. And I do think that in Sense and Sensibility, she is more restrained. She is more complex. I think that we are getting characters who, all of whom are much closer to the middle of that spectrum, right? For all that we don't get for all that we don't get just a real villain, right? We also don't get a Jane Bennet. There's no one who is absolutely perfect at the heart of this story either. So how you read it, yes, as Elizabeth's saying, but so beautifully performed. That's maybe why I like her despite her being a busybody. It's hard to argue with the charm. It's hard to argue with her being present on the page and driving the action, right? She's injecting a great deal of energy. And it's difficult when we are anchored in this part of the book, primarily in Elinor and then in Colonel Brandon. You know, we're kind of isolating ourselves off in these two very stiff, very stern, very adult grown-ups who just don't want to run hell for leather, for example, down a muddy hillside on the way back to the cottage. Speaking of which, let's get to the walk and the weather. We begin this next chapter by noting that Mrs. Dashwood is being less social than she originally intended here in the cottage, but the real purpose of this part is to introduce Allenham Court, to which we will return in just a few chapters' time, which will be a major, albeit somewhat peripheral, setting for the rest of the novel. We then send Marianne and Margaret out on their walk together after the rain has been fallen and they're feeling a little stir-crazy being cooped up inside. They gaily ascended the downs, rejoicing in their own penetration at every glimpse of blue sky, and when they caught in their faces the animating gales of a high southwesterly wind, they pitied the fears which had prevented their mother and Elinor from sharing such delightful sensations. "Is there a felicity in the world," said Marianne, "superior to this? Margaret, we will walk here at least 2 hours." Margaret agreed, and they pursued their way against the wind, resisting it with laughing delight for about 20 minutes longer, when suddenly the clouds united over their heads, and a driving rain set full in their face. Chagrined and surprised, they were obliged, though unwillingly, to turn back, for no shelter was nearer than their own house. One consolation, however, remained to them, to which the exigency of the moment gave more than usual propriety. It was that of running with all possible speed down the steep side of the hill, which led immediately to their garden gate. This is, for my money, as good a character sketch as we get of Marianne in this opening sequence. It's so joyous. It is so boisterous. It is girlish. I think naive would perhaps be a better word. There's no reason, I suppose, to gender that sense of innocent delight in the world. But it also betrays a kind of lack of pragmatism and a lack of knowledge, of foresight. One of the things that is interesting here is our relocation from Sussex into Devonshire, because now that we are in Devonshire, in the southwesterly corner of England, that southwesterly wind is pretty much coming unimpeded off of the Atlantic, right? The same is also true of Sussex, but the winds from Sussex are generally gentler and they run more southerly because they're coming in off the kind of western part of the English Channel there, right? So the weather in Sussex is a little less adversarial and certainly a little less changeable, but here in Devonshire, Marianne doesn't know enough to know that a southwesterly wind blowing into your face as you're walking along could well herald a storm within minutes, and that is, of course, exactly what happens here. And of course, we shall walk here for at least 2 hours. 20 minutes later, the storm came in. This is Austen in a mode that I like to refer to as Ron Howard in Arrested Development. This is narrator voice, as we used to say over on Twitter, right? It's that absolutely caustic, although genial intrusion from the narrative voice, kind of repositioning the optimism of the character or the assertion of the character, whatever form that takes, as something that is perhaps underdeveloped, perhaps a little unfounded here. Skipa is saying here in the chat. I think this is why I love this book. Everyone feels like a real person. I haven't read all the Austen novels, but as far as I can tell, she never indulges in Dickensian-level villainy. Praise be for that. Exactly right, Skipa. I think that, and this is to take nothing away from Dickens, right? Dickens is trying something else. Dickens is engaged in throughout most of his career at least, in an entirely different narrative modality. He is reaching for caricature as freely, as readily, as easily as he is reaching for characterization. Austen, well, I was going to say Austen doesn't do that. That is incorrect. Austen does do that, but really later in her lamentably brief career, we will never know exactly what she would have been writing into her 50s, into her 60s, into her 70s even. But certainly here, as I say, this book, more even than the others, I think, she is less committed to that strong, sharp, knife-edged characterization. You know, I think it is completely fair. One of the criticisms that you can make of Pride and Prejudice, which is really the other Austen book that I have studied extensively, although the same is true of Emma, at least in my recollection. But one of the things that you can absolutely say about Pride and Prejudice is that everyone collapses down to 2 or 3 qualities. And that's fine. That's what novelists do all the time. But it is much harder, I think, within this book. You have to go pretty deep into the supporting cast before you can collapse people down, right? Sir John really only has 2 or 3 qualities. His wife only has 2 or 3 qualities. But Lady Jennings, certainly, I would stick with that too. But all of our core cast, everyone that really matters, is much more complexly drawn, and we get to that complexity much more readily. And partly, I think, the benefit that we're seeing there is the manifestation of, we're seeing the manifestation of the benefit of having these dual protagonist figures. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but one of the great advantages of this book is being able to reposition the narrative in Marianne's POV, which we do sparingly, but we do from time to time. Occasionally we're in Mrs. Dashwood's POV, but we're in Elinor's POV for much of the time. So we're kind of following Marianne, who is the protagonist by the measure of the plot, who is, in this part of the novel at least, who is like carrying the greatest conflict, who is engaged in the greatest action. Marianne traditionally would be recognized as the protagonist, and Elinor would be more of a point of view figure, more of a narrator figure. But it's kept in constant movement. It's kept in constant rotation, in constant orbit around this common core of Austen's narrative voice itself, which is just, is just completely unparalleled. I think it's just phenomenal. Glad Rebecca's noting, I always liked rolling down hills when I was a little kid. I did too. I loved that. Where my grandmother lived in the small village of Fochabers in Murray in the northeast of Scotland. She had a long, long meadow behind her house running down to the old stone wall that ran around the part of the estate where she lived. She lived in a very old part of a country home estate. And I would, go out and just roll down through the grasses in the summertime until the bugs got too bad and you just couldn't do that anymore. The midges would come out toward the end of August for sure. Let's continue on, I suppose, with where we're going, because of course we got to the run down the hill, which I also wanted to talk about. This idea of Marianne and Margaret completely indulging themselves in an opportunity that has been presented to them, right? This consolation, the exigence of the moment gave more than usual propriety. It was of running with all possible speed down the steep side of the hill, which led immediately to the garden gate, because, of course, ladies don't run. Even girls don't run. It is gauche. It is common. But because of this storm, they are being afforded the opportunity to absolutely break the rules of social conduct, which is a thing that Marianne delights in. Not because Marianne wants to oppose or deconstruct, not systematically oppose or deconstruct the social order, right? It's not that she thinks necessarily that the social order is inherently unjust. It is that she will maximize her opportunity for engagement and enjoyment and sensuality and physical pleasure in the world, right? These things which are denied women of this period because of propriety. But here in these moments where that restriction isn't even really lifted, but you can make an argument that it should be lifted. Well, Mama, of course we were running. It was just the rain, right? If you can make the argument that is enough, and it is better always to ask for forgiveness rather than permission. Of course, we do have a problem here. Marianne falls and twists her ankles and is rescued by a man with a gun and 2 dogs, which Instagram assures me is absolutely irresistible to a certain kind of woman. The gentleman offered his services, and perceiving that her modesty declined what her situation rendered necessary, took her up in his arms without further delay and carried her down the hill. Then, passing through the garden, the gate of which had been left open by Margaret, he bore her directly into the house, whither Margaret was just arrived, and quitted not his hold till he had seated her in a chair in the parlour. Elinor and her mother rose up in amazement at their entrance, and while the eyes of both were fixed on him with evident wonder and a secret admiration, which equally sprung from his appearance, he apologized for his intrusion by relating its cause in a manner so frank and so graceful that his person, which was uncommonly handsome, received additional charms from his voice and expression. Had he been even old, ugly, and vulgar, the gratitude and kindness of Mrs. Dashwood would have been secured by any act of attention to her child, but the influence of youth, beauty, and elegance gave an interest to the action which came home to her feelings. One of the all-time meet-cutes. One of the all-time... It's almost upsetting that it's 1811, right? Austen is basically inventing the modern romance novel and kind of nails it. Like, it doesn't really get much better than this. The handsome man appearing out of nowhere, carrying you, recognizing that your situation right now, just as Marianne recognized that the oncoming storm kind of gave her permission to run down the hill, so Willoughby here recognizes that her particular circumstance allow him to set aside standards and propriety, right? He gets to pick her up and carry her home, to carry her not just through the garden gate, which, boy, is pretty intrusive anyway, but all the way into the parlor, and not even handing her to her mother, not even letting her stand and sit herself, but to put her down in a chair. I'm not sure that this particular romantic archetype gets any better than this. I don't know. I mean, I'm surrounded here by people who are perhaps more qualified to talk about male romantic archetypes in the chat tonight. What do you guys think? Is this one of the better examples? Is this one of the best examples? So we see too how Mrs. Dashwood, and I'll roll this back just a little to kind of enfold Mrs. Dashwood and what we were saying earlier about these characters being just that bit more complex, just that bit more grounded, just that bit more nuanced, just that bit more internally kind of contradictory in a really interesting and crunchy and believable way. One of the things that we see here from Mrs. Dashwood, and we see pretty consistently from Mrs. Dashwood, is that she is no Mrs. Bennet, right? Mrs. Bennet is, as many of you feel, a very problematic figure in Pride and Prejudice, and Mr. Bennet equally so. But Mrs. Dashwood, I think, because of her genuine concern and care for her children, kind of escapes any of the accusations that we feel fall at the feet of Mrs. Bennet. As we see here, right? It is true that he is incredibly good looking. It's true that he's in his shooting jacket. It's true that he's here all manly and wind tousled and just the right amount of damp from the rain, carrying Marianne in this courteous chivalric gesture of care and concern. But the narrative voice taking this opportunity to point out, had he been old, ugly, and vulgar, the gratitude and kindness of Mrs. Dashwood would have been secured by any act of attention to her child. She wouldn't even pay attention to his nature for taking this kindness. But the fact that he's handsome, the fact that he immediately offers this explanation, the fact that he is frank and graceful, right? He's direct, but he's also sufficiently courteous. He's sufficiently elegant. He's clearly well-bred and well-mannered, right? As you would be at this point if you were holding both a gun and were also in possession of two dogs. I think that that's a pretty good marker of gentility too. So, we see here that Willoughby's manners are impeccable, including not just the bringing in of Marianne and the setting down of her, but also his swift departure, right? He does the formal thing. He accepts the introduction and makes the arrangement for a subsequent visit, which is exactly how one ought to conduct oneself under these circumstances. So their affection for him, their appreciation of him, their respect for him, their liking of him is immediate and then reinforced by his actions. And as I say, this is all in the wake of Marianne in this heightened moment, in this moment of throwing off the shackles of everyday life, of running down the hill, of celebrating her like physicality in the world, to crash therefore into Willoughby in effect. We can imagine how heightened this is. It's just, as I say, it's a fantastically observed character introduction, and many modern writers have struggled to do it as well as Austen does it right here. So this then is Willoughby. This is his first appearance. Sir John gives Marianne some more information about him, including his ability to dance for hours on end without taking a break. We're leaning pretty hard here, I think, on Sir John's reputation as a character witness, right, on his ability to really judge the character of the people of his acquaint, but all the same, to the extent that we are putting any pressure on that here, I think we are putting pressure on it comedically. It is that Sir John only has two modes, and it seems like both of them are kind of this effusive enthusiasm and a certain insensibility. So during this, we get this lovely technical formality too. We do this pretty thoroughly throughout, but I wanted to call attention to it here because it can also lead to confusion as we move through the book. This is the thing that post-Regency writers often get wrong about the Regency period because the formality and the use of titles is extremely important, and we're going to see those titles fall away as we move through this week's reading. It happens really quickly with Marianne and Willoughby, but here it is introduced or reinforced in such a way as we can't really miss it. I'm thinking specifically of Sir John referring to Elinor as Miss Dashwood because she is the elder daughter, and Marianne as Miss Marianne. That's the formality, right? Elinor holds this position as eldest daughter and thus, kind of inheritor in waiting of the family name. Oh, I should note too that we also are told that Willoughby last Christmas, while staying up until 4 a.m. dancing, was then up at 8 to covert, which means fox hunting, right, in the traditional British redcoat style, usually not on horseback or not always on horseback in Devonshire during that time period. Oftentimes it was a more covert, thus the name, I suppose. There's a reason that my mind went to that word specifically. It is called covert because they are hiding. They are putting themselves up in a hide, waiting for foxes who have spent the night eating and plundering the local farmyards to return to their dens and shooting them on sight when the foxes are full and slow. So that is what is happening. And I'll note too that we're presented several times here with the idea that the upper class of this period keep late hours. We're told before the frankly awful sounding communal outing that they're going to breakfast at 10 o'clock and then get underway, which was by no means unusual, right? We're even told that Willoughby keeps later hours than that. Some parties that Austen attends, there are accounts in Austen's letters of her returning home after a public ball, not even a private ball. Oh, we mentioned that too here. The distinction is very clear, I suppose. If you live somewhere where there are enough people, then you can attend public balls, which are simply ticketed. They're usually held in town halls, that kind of thing. And private balls are held in people's houses, which means that they are more exclusive, right? The kind of people that you will meet at a private ball are that much more high class. But there are letters in which Austen accounts, kind of tumbling home from a public ball, even a less special event at 5 a.m, at even 6 a.m. So we kept very late hours. There's also references, I think, to parties traveling by moonlight, that moonlit nights are particularly popular, and that is because of exactly that provision. It means that traveling to the party, particularly in the later months of the year, traveling to the party is easier because the moon is up and is providing light out on those country roads, and the same when you are traveling home in a very drunken state. Skiba says that's not very sportsmanlike. For all that fox hunters think themselves to be sportsmen, Skiba, I can assure you, as I'm sure you know from your time in the UK too, they are among the least sportsmanlike gentlemen, for sure. Let's get into chapter 10 then, with Willoughby coming to visit, and in his POV, we get something that is basically unprecedented in Austen's work. We get an actual, honest-to-God physical description. Miss Dashwood had a delicate complexion, regular features, and a remarkably pretty figure. Marianne was still handsomer. Her form, though not as correct as her sister's, in having the advantage of height was more striking, and her face was so lovely that when, in the common cant of praise, she was called a beautiful girl, truth was less violently outraged than usually happens. Her skin was very brown, but from its transparency, her complexion was uncommonly brilliant. Her features were all good. Her smile was sweet and attractive, and in her eyes, which were very dark, there was a life, a spirit, an eagerness which could hardly be seen without delight. From Willoughby, their expression was at first held back by the embarrassment which the remembrance of his assistance created. But when this passed away, when her spirits became collected, when she saw that to the perfect good breeding of the gentleman he united frankness and vivacity, and above all when she heard him declare that of music and dancing he was passionately fond, she gave him such a look of approbation as secured the largest share of his discourse to herself for the rest of his stay. Again, we're noting this primarily, not just because it's beautifully written, though it is, but because it is rare. We get very few examples of outright character description. And in part, I think that is because we, to borrow the vernacular, we head hop less frequently in the later Austen books. One of the things that lets Sense and Sensibility adopt all of these different rhetorical tiers and rhetorical perspectives, one of the things that allows the narrative to move so freely around these characters as they are sitting and talking in combination, is that we are willing to break perspective and move into someone else's head. Here we just get Willoughby's full-on, close-up shot on Marianne here and his accounting of her, which is, I think, really, really lovely. Skipa's calling out, are we in the era where deathly pale skin was the height of fashion? Indeed, we are, Skipa. Extremely pale and very liable to blush furiously. The preferred style for upper class ladies at this time is, very pale skin with that not makeup, because makeup has not yet really been kind of rehabilitated from the working classes, shall we say, very specifically working classes, from sex workers, effectively, right? There's still an idea, an association of a kind of dissolute harlotry associated with makeup at this period. That will change, of course, as we move into the Victorian period, and makeup gets repositioned as a very kind of affected upper class occupation. But at this point, we want to be very natural. We want to nonetheless be extremely pale and quote unquote pure, right? We get this accounting of Marianne's brown skin here, which has led some people, and all power to them, quite frankly, to offer commentaries or speculation about Marianne's ethnicity, about possibly her positioning as a biracial heroine, which there's absolutely nothing in the text that supports that, but go for it. Like, I don't think it changes really materially anything in the book, so by all means indulge yourself. But what we're really meaning here, because you'll remember that Lizzie Bennet is also referred to as having brown hands and having brown skin. It is simply a tan. It is simply this idea that you are outdoorsy, you are physical, right? It is also undesirable for women at this period to have any kind of like a muscle tone, any kind of like sculpting going on, any indication that that woman is engaged in manual labor or physical pursuits is generally recognized as being a negative thing. We want our women to be as weak and wan as we possibly can at that period. So that's kind of positioning Marianne there. And we see how, we kind of dispense with Elinor as almost the model, right? It's like Elinor is the imperial standard for attractiveness at this time, right? You are one Elinor's worth of hot. A delicate complexion, regular features, and a remarkably pretty figure. But let's talk about Marianne, right? Her form, though not so correct as her sister's, meaning symmetrical here, right? This is also the period when we think that the more symmetrical a face is, the more beautiful that person must be. A position that we have really radically, I think, moved away from in our understanding of modern beauty standards, right? Which is not to say that modern beauty standards are worth any more than Regency era beauty standards were, but rather that our understanding of where attractiveness can be found and who we generally find attractive has definitely moved away from this idea of a kind of mathematical proportional symmetry of figure and expression, right? We've kind of pulled away from that to something less symmetrical directly. But here we see that Marianne is less symmetrical and still more attractive, and having the advantage of height was more striking. The younger sister is the taller sister in this instance. Her face was so lovely that when, in the common cant of praise, she was called a beautiful girl, every girl gets called beautiful, right? Everybody, you can't, really say good morning to a young woman without saying, well, aren't you beautiful? Aren't you a beautiful girl? Or referring to the niece of someone or the cousin of someone as a beautiful girl. But in this one instance, says Austen, it's more justified than it usually is, which gives us, I think, a really strong sense of how striking Marianne is too, which of course we get here at the end of this account. Initially, she has this light in her eyes. She has this very striking look in her eyes, a life, a spirit, and eagerness which could hardly be seen without delight. And she is withholding it from Willoughby, partly, because of her embarrassment, and partly because we might speculate kind of dignity, decency, like courtesy here in this instance. But then when she finally turns those headlights on full, when she finally gives him the look, he is enchanted. He immediately turns to her, as we see, secures the largest share of his discourse to herself for the rest of the stay. Yes. Galanter Becky says, I guess England's weather makes it hard to not be deathly pale. Yes. Yes. I mean, by a certain standard, right? Certainly, I think that there's a lot of a predilection for pallor among the fair-skinned people of England. But yeah, I mean, this is continually kind of echoing this. I was hesitating. I was going to do a piece on this, and I haven't prepared it, so I will perhaps just push this back to next week's reading as we begin volume 2. I think would maybe be the better time to talk about this. But this novel is fascinatingly positioned by Austen because it is at the same time so achingly conscious of class, like very specifically like the class of not even 1811, but like 1805, right? Like the very early 19th century. She's so aware of class. It suffuses every single interaction. Like standards and decency are all over this book. And yet she doesn't consciously address it really at any turn. And that I think is absolutely fascinating. It's a kind of narratorial privilege that one gets when one is inventing the novel, and one gets to decide what realism looks like on the page, which, and I'm crediting her a lot with inventing the novel, and I don't really mean that. Of course, novels existed prior to Jane Austen, but she does elevate and refine the form and really does, I think, land the romantic novel, what we would even think of as a romantic comedy novel, lands it for the first time. I think the first really truly successful romantic comedy might well be this book. Glad Rebecca says, I love that last phrase, truth was less violently outraged than usually happens. Yeah, exactly. Isn't it great? Isn't it just fantastic? So, Marianne and Willoughby far exceed here this brief, tasteful, superficial, getting to know you, hey, how are you kind of conversation, and immediately get into their discussion of dancing and music and books. Elinor later highlights Cooper, who we discussed last week, and Sir Walter Scott, which is fascinating for a book published in 1811, because at this point, Walter Scott was primarily, I mean, exclusively known as a poet. He had not yet published the work for which he is most famous. Waverley won't be published until 1814, Rob Roy won't be published until 1817, and his most influential work, Ivanhoe, won't be published until 1820. So it's absolutely fascinating that as a modern reader, I can look at this book and go, oh, sure, Cooper, sure, okay. Oh, and Scott, that makes a lot of sense. Of course, they would be talking about Sir Walter Scott, but they're not talking about the Walter Scott that I've read. Honestly, I've read very little of his poetry and probably never will, I gotta say, for my sins. We also name check Alexander Pope here, a very cool-headed rationalist, right? On the sense to sensibility spectrum, he is very sense, which is why it is important that Willoughby appreciates his work no more than is proper during this period. And I do think that there's something happening. This is another one of these topics that I'm just kind of throw up in the air here, and we'll see where it lands in terms of our future discussion. But I do want, as we're moving through this discussion, this sparring, this teasing between Elinor and Marianne, as Elinor is teasing her sister about having left no stone unturned, that there cannot possibly be a detail that she does not know about Willoughby after their first meeting. She just gave him this absolute interrogation, which both of them, by all accounts, seem to really enjoy. And Elinor is actively teasing her sister and being, I think, very light on her feet about it. But Marianne's sensibility, there's something in her passion that kind of makes her unfunny. That makes her as a character, not necessarily unfunny on the page. I think that we can enjoy Marianne a great deal, but I think that I want to think more about wit and good humor in Austen's works in general, in this book in particular. I want to spend some time thinking about wherein wit is derived, how characters are allowed to be funny on the page diegetically for each other, and not just funny pointed at us, right? Not just funny for the benefit of the reader, which I think is absolutely something that Austen has already effectively mastered, both her character work and her narrative voice too. But I really want to think about how we allow, in particular, women to be funny and amusing. Yeah. Okay, let's that's right. I did flag this. I wanted to note because I received a question about it and I forgot to write down the question. I forgot to write down who it was. I just left myself a note saying that I have been listening to the Rosalind Landor version of the audiobook published by Dreamscape. And one of the things that Rosalind Landor does is give a lot of the conversations between Elinor and Marianne like a very sharp-edged, flinty kind of aspect, which I do not think is incorrect. Like, I don't think that I can look at the page and say, that's not how this should be read categorically, but it feels more firm and pointed and acerbic than I read it on the page. I'm inclined to give both of these young women a much lighter reading and give them a real sense of playfulness with each other, a real enjoyment of each other that occasionally breaks when emotions become a little more heightened. But yeah, the Rosalind Landor version published by Dreamscape is a very good audiobook version of this book. Okay. And of course, yeah, I know that we're talking about the casting of the movie here in the YouTube chat. And of course, that is part of my desire to hear the voice of this book as being a little more light and a little more playful and a little more witty and a little more composed, is because I'm hearing Emma Thompson. I'm hearing the pen and the voice of Emma Thompson. I'm hearing the screenplay and the performance, and of course, all of her many, many other performances too. Emma Thompson is absolutely one of my favorite actors of all time, and was particularly influential for me through that period in the mid-1990s. I think that God, she's just extraordinary. And it's so difficult because she is so surrounded in, here we are talking about the film, she is so surrounded in that film by extraordinary performances, right? I just think it is a wall-to-wall knockout cast. I think they are fantastic. And she is so selfless. One of the things that really distinguishes her as an actor is how generous she can be in these individual moments, in these individual scenes, how she can serve the story and not her own moment. And that is just brilliant. God, I would happily, if you guys just want to do like Elizabeth, I know you're still here in the chat. If you want to do just a casual series over on Patreon where we just watch all, can we make a pitch for Emma Thompson being the other Last Star in Hollywood? Like, I know we can't really, but Last Star in Britain, maybe that's how we pivot that idea. If you guys haven't heard The Last Star in Hollywood, it's a podcast dedicated to the career and filmography of Tom Cruise. You can find it over at LastStarPod.com. It's finished now, but it's pretty good. It's a pretty good series. Okay, let's get into it because I'm burning daylight here. We skip through the merits of Marianne's refusal to stick to small talk, and we get to, let me actually conclude this, because we get to what is, for me at least, and I'd be really curious to see what you guys think of this. This, to me, is the first real red flag that we get from Willoughby. I do not dislike him. I consider him, on the contrary, as a very respectable man who has everybody's good word and nobody's notice, who has more money than he can spend, more time than he knows how to employ, and 2 new coats every year. Add to which, cried Marianne, that he has neither genius, taste, nor spirit, that his understanding has no brilliancy, his feelings no ardour, and his voice no expression. You decide on his imperfections so much in the mass, replied Elinor, and so much on the strength of your own imagination, that the commendation I am able to give of him is comparatively cold and insipid. I can only pronounce him to be a sensible man, well-bred, well-informed, of gentle address, and, I believe, possessing an amiable heart. Miss Dashwood, cried Willoughby, you are now using me unkindly. You are endeavouring to disarm me by reason, and to convince me against my will, but it will not do. You shall find me as stubborn as you can be artful. I have 3 unanswerable reasons for disliking Colonel Brandon. He has threatened me with rain when I wanted it to be fine. He has found fault with the hanging of my curricle, and I cannot persuade him to buy my brown mare. If it will be any satisfaction to you, however, to be told that I believe his character to be, in other respects, irreproachable, I am ready to confess it. And in return for an acknowledgement, which must give me some pain, you cannot deny me the privilege of disliking him as much as ever. And there is something here which feels very modern. There is something here which feels like a lot of manospheric discourse on the internet. This feels to me to be a lot of butthurt little boys out there on Twitter complaining about how their feelings have a right to exist too. You can't argue them out of their feelings. And perhaps it is just my position. Perhaps it is a consequence of my temporal positioning right now. Perhaps it is a consequence of all that we have endured together to make it to 2025. But God, I have no sympathy for Willoughby in this moment. This is absolutely the point in the book where he loses me. This time through, this is the point where I can't be charmed by him. I was so charmed by his first appearance and even his first interactions with Marianne. But this gambit here, that because of course, right, we're positioning this as something that, well, okay, before we get, let's try and do this in chronological order, okay? This first objection that Willoughby has to Colonel Brandon. He's a very respectable man who has everybody's good word and nobody's notice. Well, yes, he's fine, but he's boring. He's beige. He's wallpaper. We don't care about him. He has more money than he can spend, more time than he knows how to employ, and 2 new coats every year. That he is so comfortable, so well provisioned, that there's nothing interesting or exciting or challenging about him, that he does not provoke our sensibility, that he does not provoke passion in any single living person. And Marianne just backs him up, right? Marianne coming in with the right hook off the ropes there. He has neither genius, taste, nor spirit, that his understanding has no brilliancy, his feelings no ardor, his voice no expression. Marianne just said 6 things that all mean the same thing, effectively, but, you know, I'm the last person in the world to be upset about that particular quirk of character. But nonetheless, this is Marianne voicing exactly what she voiced about Edward, right? That Colonel Brandon is simply insufficiently alive. His joie is not de viving, right? He's not getting the same kind of pleasure from life as Marianne seeks, that Marianne has in her defense, but also actively seeks, that Willoughby also seems to possess. And Elinor is kind of rocked back on her heels. This is another one of these moments where I see this very dry wit coming through Elinor. You decide on his imperfections so much in the mass and so much on the strength of your own imagination. How am I supposed to argue with this, you lunatics? What are you talking about? You have created a guy that you are now making fun of, who so completely does not match the guy that I know that I can't defend him without sounding as though I'm co-signing your criticisms of him by being so meek and genteel, right? To say that he is a sensible man, well-bred, well-informed, of gentle address, and I believe possessing an amiable heart. And even that weak riposte is too much for Willoughby to endure, right? His feelings are so fragile and so goddamn important that he can't even take that rejoinder from Elinor. You are now using me unkindly. You are endeavoring to disarm me by reason to convince me against my will. Which is exactly the point, right? He has taken against Colonel Brandon. Obviously, there are complicating factors that we will learn about in future paragraphs, in future chapters, but still, he has decided to take against Colonel Brandon and will not be convinced. He will not be moved by the evidence presented to him. And the absurdity of the 3 reasons, and for what it's worth, I do believe that Willoughby is being here absurd. I don't think that Willoughby is actually believing that Elinor will accept this accounting of his grievances against Colonel Brandon, because they are just so ridiculous, right? That he has threatened me with rain when I wanted it to be fine. Well, the weather is not under his control. So even if he did say, damn you, I hope it rains, right? Come on now, that's not a real thing at all. He has found fault with the hanging of my curricle, which, you know, any other writer but Austen, I would think, was perilously close to being a double entendre, right? A curricle is one of those very light 2-wheeled carriages with 2 very large wheels, with usually led by 2 horses, with this sprung carriage in the middle suspended between the 2 wheels. It's very lightweight. It's very fast. It's also very dangerous because the balancing is necessarily precise, and it's very easy to flip or to overturn one of these things, right? It's a little tricky there. But also the hanging of my curricle does feel, you know, like sailor talk. It feels like something that the men would say in the boys' club, in the gentlemen's club. And I cannot persuade him to buy my brown mare is obviously so inconsequential. It's a business proposition that he's not being picked up on. I do not take these to be sincere. I do not think that in this moment Willoughby is presenting them as sincere, but falling back on this idea that his feelings are just so important that he cannot be challenged in them. Yeah, in 2025, that is absolutely a red flag. I also wanted to call out, because it does get a little bit of criticism. There are people who are very hardline about this, and I don't really understand it, which is one of the reasons that I pulled this quote for tonight's title. Neither genius, taste, nor spirit. There are those who argue very powerfully that neither nor constructions have to be binary constructions, which is kind of the most accepted form, but is not by any means the only form. It's not the only exclusive form. If we turn, as we always should, to Cambridge grammar on this subject, we will find that there are 3 neither nor constructions which are permitted. The binary construction, right? It is neither this nor that. There's also the multiple construction. It is neither this, that, nor the other, right? He is neither kind, handsome, nor rich, is what the Cambridge grammar gives us. Or we have this kind of binary main clause coordination, right? Neither did he oversleep, nor was his bus late, is the example that Cambridge grammar gives us. So all of these are completely acceptable forms. I think that the multiple form is more common here in the United States. I certainly, when I think of that form, I think of, and this is intuitive, so I don't know that I could quote this chapter in verse, but I think of Faulkner. I think of Twain. And certainly when I think of more formal British writing, and certainly more formal British academic writing, I do tend to think of that binary construction, that very strict neither this nor that formulation. But all are acceptable. Let's all just relax. Let's get into chapter 11. Wow, I'm taking my sweet time moving through all of this tonight, but we are going to skip over a couple of chapters relatively quickly here. In chapter 11, we spend some time in the fine society of Devonshire, and in Elinor's POV, we get this really touching sequence where we're talking about her loneliness, in effect, right? We're talking about how she still pines for Norland Park and how she is still thinking about Edward, even though she is not expressing any of that in an outward fashion. She is not confiding in her sister or in either of her sisters. I'm sorry. Margaret just tends to drop out of the story, and indeed drops out of the story pretty soon. She doesn't confide in her sisters about her lingering feelings for Edward and her sense of loneliness, but we're told here in this moment, because we're able to move into her POV, that is still true. We're getting all this stuff from Mrs. Jennings, still this world-class gossip, but then luckily we confide in or find a confidant in the unexpected figure of Colonel Brandon. And I'm going to call up this slide right here. I'm going to continue to call him Colonel Brandon. I think I'm going to continue to call him his proper title, because just calling him Brandon makes him sound like a skateboard teen in the 1990s. Oh, wait, I found this. Let me... Yes. Did you know, faithful listeners, that the name Brandon peaked in the United States in the year 1985, where 1.5% of baby boys were given that name? It was the 13th most popular boy's name of 1985, right between Ryan at 12 and Jason at 14, all of which I feel like have aged a great deal. These are the things that you get distracted by and research when you're working on a Jane Austen podcast. Anyway, yes, we've got our slide back to Colonel, let's say Colonel Jason. That also seems appropriate. Elinor's compassion for him increased as she had reason to suspect that the misery of disappointed love had already been known to him. This suspicion was given by some words which accidentally dropped from him one evening at the park, when they were sitting down together by mutual consent while the others were dancing. His eyes were fixed on Marianne, and after a silence of some minutes, he said with a faint smile, "Your sister, I understand, does not approve of second attachments." "No," replied Elinor. "Her opinions are all romantic. Or rather, as I believe, she considers them impossible to exist." "I believe she does. But how she contrives it without reflecting on the character of her own father, who had himself 2 wives, I know not. A few years, however, will settle her opinions on the reasonable basis of common sense and observation, and then they may be more easy to define and to justify than they are now by anybody but herself." "This will probably be the case," he replied. "And yet there is something so amiable in the prejudices of a young mind that one is sorry to see them give way to the reception of more general opinions." One of my favorite moments, and coupled with the favorite moment that I could not pull because the slide would simply have been too long. But of course, Elinor immediately pushes back on this. She's like, no, smartness is smartness, wisdom is wisdom. Like let us not celebrate naivete. Let us not, pin gold badges on people, particularly young women, for not knowing the world well enough. That doesn't seem like a really cool thing that we should be doing. But I really like this perspective from Brandon, not because it's specifically attached to Marianne or to young women in general, but the idea that there is something in these prejudices which are formed from our first contact with the world, that there's an immediate response. We internalize the rules of how we think the world ought to work very swiftly, and then it takes a lot of growth to come out of them. But there is something nonetheless charming about those first responses, those first ideas, right? As Elinor points out here, the completely unsupported idea that Marianne does not believe that you can fall in love more than once, despite the fact that her own father did so, right? That she has to acknowledge that he was in love with John's mother too, the first Mrs. Dashwood, as well as being in love with her own mother. Presumably she does not, right? Presumably she has either some complicated workaround in her mind, or she's just ignoring the whole thing, which, I kind of see it. Elizabeth's saying in the chat here, it's really strange to me how little most of the main characters communicate compared to how gossipy and chatty Mrs. Jennings is. I suppose it's a matter of class and manners as well, but it would save a lot of heartache and confusion. I mean, it absolutely would. We're going to see how those... She adds, not to say there should be more gossips, just more honesty and forthrightness. I think you're completely right. I think that that will be the culmination of our core plot here. One of the things that we will reckon with is the keeping of secrets and why we keep those secrets. The secrets that are kept, as is so often the case in the course of this book, out of shame. And the secrets that are kept out of a protection of one's intimacies, a desire to preserve the privacy of others, a desire to carefully kind of presumptively almost watch out for other people's feelings too. It is a complicated space. I think that Austen, as you do, Elizabeth, comes down on, we should all probably be talking more freely to each other. We should all definitely be expressing ourselves more readily. Yeah. So I love, again, this was the point that I was thinking of when I mentioned earlier the benefit of the dual protagonist structure of this novel, right? By following Elinor here, we get more insight, we get more depth from Marianne's story without knocking her off her pedestal or knocking her out of her arc as like the primary plot protagonist of the story at this point. We don't have to make her either oblivious to what is happening or immovable in her beliefs. We get to offer this commentary and kind of celebrate where she is through Brandon in this moment, and also appeal to this hope of improvement, which is going to also be such a major theme, right? Elinor is going to Elinor does give voice here to the desire that her sister improve, that her sister kind of become more of herself, right? And improvement will be a topic that we'll discuss. Yeah, as Galadriel Becky says, not just keeping secrets, but basic discretion. Yes, exactly, right? What is the value of discretion? What is the value of dignity? What is the value of privacy? I mean, again, every single week of this series, I'm going to say something along the lines of, whoever thinks that Jane Austen has nothing to say about life in 2025 needs to read this book, because these are issues that we are all reckoning with right now as we decide whether or not we want to cohabitate en masse in this digital space, or whether we have already, whether we're already pot committed, whether that die has already been cast and we are now living in the consequence of a post-privacy world. What is the value of privacy? What is the value of dignity? What is the value of discretion? What is the value of allowing ourselves to be thought ill of in order to protect others, in dismissing what we think of the opinions of others because we know what is true? That is an extremely challenging and complicated set of circumstances that we are all now, thanks to the internet, called upon to navigate all the time. We conclude here with Colonel Brandon coming close to saying too much, right? The narrative just hinting there at a story which will be disclosed later. But it leaves us on this moment of, here, as we're talking about discretion, as we're talking about privacy, here on this moment of a really surprising and profound and interestingly, fascinatingly, kind of aromantic intimacy between Elinor and Colonel Brandon there. Let's get into chapter 12. I'm looking nervously at the number of slides that I have. I think we're going to be okay. I think we can probably make it, but so much for my desire to try and keep the show down to an hour, huh? Let's move on then to chapter 12. The chapter that begins with the gift of the horse, right? If you're not sure about Willoughby so far, maybe the gift of the horse is going to just push you over the edge into thinking that maybe something's not right, or something is at least a little thoughtless, a little careless, a little lacking in prudence and caution from this young man in a way that is going to have direct consequences for Marianne's family. I mean, I get that on the one hand, gifts of horses, I have been told, are apparently one of the major love languages of teenage girls, but there is the romantic gesture, and then there is the practicality. Not only will this horse have to be stabled and fed and cared for, but Marianne can't go riding by herself because of the scandal of the thing, because of the appearance of the thing, which will necessitate a whole second horse and someone to ride it, a servant or Elinor to ride it with Marianne, which leads us to this. As Elinor is challenging Marianne on this, Marianne says, "You're mistaken, Elinor," said she warmly, "in supposing I know very little of Willoughby. I have not known him long indeed, but I am much better acquainted with him than I am with any other creature in the world except yourself and mamma. It is not time or opportunity that is to determine intimacy. It is disposition alone. 7 years would be insufficient to make some people acquainted with each other, and 7 days are more than enough for others. I should hold myself guilty of greater impropriety in accepting a horse from my brother than from Willoughby. Of John I know very little, though we have lived together for years, but of Willoughby my judgment has long been formed." And as I return again and again to this idea that Austen is giving us very well-rounded, well-rendered, complex characters, this is one of those moments where you kind of think, yeah, actually, she's making a properly good point. This isn't a Lydia and Wickham situation. This is something much more complex. Even if you're feeling those red flags, even if you're feeling those warning signs about Willoughby, there is something here that is romantic and passionate and intimate. And she's right that there is a degree of disposition. We ought not to believe that long familiarity is the only path to intimacy. People can connect very intensely, very immediately, decency and dignity aside. It's interesting, too, here, though, that we're also opening up this idea of irony. Well, there's irony in two different ways, right? Firstly, Willoughby. You are mistaken, Elinor, in supposing I know very little of Willoughby. This is the first time that Marianne drops the Mr. This is the first time that she is using his last name, yes, but in effect, his given name. That is a step toward a greater intimacy. We're going to see this echoed in just a page when Willoughby uses Marianne's name without the Miss in front of it. The other kind of ironic thing here at the end, I should hold myself guilty of greater impropriety in accepting a horse from my brother than from Willoughby, right? I should not accept a horse from someone that I barely know, John. I should accept a horse from someone I know really well, another man named John. We are going to find out later in the story that Willoughby's first name is also John, and I think that we're leaning here on a certain foreshadowed irony here, a kind of dramatic irony. We move through the rest of this chapter with a brief comic scene. It's fun. I like Margaret well enough, and I like Margaret being questioned by Mrs. Jennings about the object of Elinor's affections. I like how we handle it. I like the interplay between the sisters. It feels very well realized and very kind of organic. This is where Margaret, who shall be known as Snitches, is silenced by Marianne in a process known as Will Get Stitches. And Margaret kind of fumbles her way through an explanation which is almost sufficient to appease Mrs. Jennings, but doesn't really give the game away for Elinor either, which is, it's kind of nice, but it's also fairly inessential, although it is very gentlemanly, I think. I love the way that Lady Middleton comes in at the end to observe the change in the weather, just as a desire to be done with this god-awful conversation about which she could not care less. And Colonel Brandon steps in to kind of to co-sign that change of subject in a really nice and thoughtful way. I like how that's handled. Let's get into chapter 13 then. The expedition to Colonel Brandon's brother-in-law's estate, 12 miles from Barton Park. Having made this plan, we get no more than half a page into the chapter when the mail arrives, and as the mail so often does, it throws us for a loop. We are told that Colonel Brandon has to immediately depart for London this minute, and then we are presented with a scene in which everyone else shows themselves to be the worst, except that when he leaves, they will then show themselves to be the double worst. They will get even more objectionable. Let's get into this slide here. "If you would but let us know what your business is," said Mrs. Jennings, "we might see whether it could be put off or not." "You would not be 6 hours later," said Willoughby, "if you were to defer your journey till our return." "I cannot afford to lose 1 hour." Elinor then heard Willoughby say in a low voice to Marianne, "There are some people who cannot bear a party of pleasure. Brandon is one of them. He was afraid of catching cold, I dare say, and invented this trick for getting out of it. I would lay 50 guineas the letter was of his own writing." "I have no doubt of it," replied Marianne. "There is no persuading you to change your mind, Brandon, I know of old," said Sir John. "Well, once you are determined on anything, but however, I hope you will think better of it. Consider, here are the 2 Miss Careys come from Newton, and 3 Miss Dashwoods walked up from the cottage, and Mr. Willoughby got up 2 hours before his usual time on purpose to go to Whitwell." The way that we challenge Brandon here, particularly Mrs. Jennings, right? I mentioned this, I alluded to this earlier. In this sequence, in almost every single line of dialogue that Colonel Brandon has that is oriented to or around Mrs. Jennings, he addresses her as ma'am. He is trying to demonstrate, without having to call her out, he is using the formal mode of address to try to communicate with her that her line of questioning is improper, that her line of questioning is inappropriate. And her daughter is the one that picks up on it, right? Her daughter is the one that says, "Hey, knock it off. You shouldn't be talking to him like this." I'm roughly, crudely paraphrasing there, but still, nonetheless, that is the crux of it. In any case, Brandon sets out. London is about 170 miles east of Barton. The average travel speed by horse at that time, horse and coach in this instance, is about 5 miles an hour. It is a bare minimum of a 2.5 day journey to London for Colonel Brandon, even by the 6-horse coach that he plans on taking. Elizabeth says in the chat, this is where I lose Willoughby. I can excuse his earlier bickering, but this is such bad behavior. It absolutely is. And also shows himself to be immoderate, right? Like lacking in proper courtesy. It is one thing to talk smack about someone behind their back. It's quite another to be whispering to your girlfriend right there in front of everyone, putting everyone else in a difficult position too. But we also get to see his lack of moderation here, that he would bet 50 guineas. I think even that casual expression suggests a kind of an imprudence, right? A desire. I mean, we can assume that he is a gambling gentleman because at that point most gentlemen were gamblers, but this seems to be a large sum on something particularly trivial, something that would be effortless to disprove in any case. So Brandon takes off. We then introduce, via Mrs. Jennings' ever-increasing awfulness, Miss Williams, apparently Colonel Brandon's natural, that is, illegitimate daughter who lives in London. We follow up Colonel Brandon's departure with a day of driving around in carriages, during which time we learn Willoughby and Marianne go to Allenham Court and tour the gardens and the house itself, which I don't necessarily think communicates itself directly to the modern reader, which is such, as Elinor points out in the next chapter, right? Or even at the end of this chapter, such a crazy, scandalous thing to do, to go into someone else's house and tour it with, by implication, an eye to someday owning it, is such a terrible, terrible thing to do. But here it is, nonetheless. And we get this moment from Marianne and Elinor, as Elinor is, calling her out for visiting the home of Mrs. Smith, Willoughby's cousin, without obeying the formalities, without obeying the proper etiquette for such things. "I am afraid," replied Elinor, "that the pleasantness of an employment does not always evince its propriety." "On the contrary, nothing could be stronger proof of it, Elinor. For if there had been any real impropriety in what I did, I should have been sensible of it at the time, for we always know when we are acting wrong, and with such a conviction I could have had no pleasure." "But my dear Marianne, as it has already exposed you to some very impertinent remarks, do you not now begin to doubt the discretion of your own conduct? If the impertinent remarks of Miss Jennings are to be proof of impropriety in conduct, we are all offending every moment of our lives. I value not her censure any more than I do her commendation. I am not sensible of having done anything wrong in walking over Mrs. Smith's grounds or in seeing her house. They will one day be Mr. Willoughby's, and if they were to be one day your own, Marianne, you would not be justified in what you have done." Marianne, unexpectedly here, pulling out a kind of Socratic philosophy here, right? The idea that evil people only do evil from ignorance, for no rational person would ever commit an evil act, says Socrates. Thus, all evil must be born of ignorance. Thus, we must examine our lives, right? That's the other half of the unexamined life is not worth living, right? You kind of have to turn your scrutiny upon yourself, because in so doing, you will purge yourself of any possible wrongdoing, because if you were simply smart and aware enough, who would ever voluntarily choose to do evil? And I'm exaggerating here, right? Not evil in this instance, but to commit impropriety, right? to commit a careless act that will get those all too eager tongues wagging about your behavior. But this response, on the contrary, nothing could be stronger proof of it, right? This idea, the pleasantness of an employment does not always evince its propriety. Hey, enjoying something is not a measure as to its morality or appropriateness, okay? Let's recognize that right now. To which Marianne responds, actually, if I had known that what I was doing was wrong, if it had been wrong, then I wouldn't have enjoyed it. So therefore, the things that I enjoy must be good. Check and mate. Which, again, not like a strong philosophical position, but a clearly held one, right? And a well-articulated one, where again, I think it's the following up of that, right? First, Marianne asserts the philosophical position, and then backs it up with, and also, who cares what Mrs. Jennings thinks? I don't give a damn about her censure. I don't give a damn about her commendation. Her opinion is nothing to me, right? That is the Lydia response. That is the first step response that we would get from a later kind of rebellious Austen heroine. But that's not what Marianne gives us. We get instead the sensibility. No, I am attuned to the world, and if I had felt bad, then I would have known that what I was doing was wrong, and I would have stopped doing it. Is possessed of like a real, not a philosophical rigor, right? Not a rational rigor, but a real emotional truth and vibrancy, a real sensibility there. Okay, I am going to come back here to the camera for now because we are going to skip ahead. I'm very conscious of the time. So we're going to do this. We're going to jump ahead to chapter 14, and I am going to get us to the discussion that we have about the cottage, right? So this is the following chapter. We get this beautiful, very, very, very balanced paragraph, beautifully written, but really kind of odious paragraph at the beginning of this chapter in which Mrs. Jennings is kind of monologuing to herself in the third person about what is happening to Colonel Brandon. And as she goes around and round and round in circles, as she is, as we have been told before, just repeating herself and repeating herself, we kind of see her arguments ebb and flow and turn in on themselves and reinforce themselves. And it's the gossip doing what the gossip does, but it's happening within like the consciousness of one person instead of a group of people, which I find really interesting and enormously satirical, honestly. We then get Elinor noting the strange imbalance between Marianne and Willoughby's behavior, that this tension, a friction between the two, between what is evidently the case, what everyone can see with their own eyes, which is that these two are in love and are probably going to get married, right? They are absolutely dedicated to one another, but there is no word of an engagement. There is no word of a more formal connection. And that is surprising to Elinor and ought perhaps to be surprising to us. We learn here too that Willoughby, though independent, is not wealthy, which will be crucial to our understanding later. But what I want to do just to wrap up tonight is look at one more slide where we're really leaning, I think, on the interiority of Willoughby, and we really get a sense of what is happening to him and with him. One evening in particular, about a week after Colonel Brandon had left the country, his heart seemed more than usually open to every feeling of attachment to the objects around him. And on Mrs. Dashwood's happening to mention her design of improving the cottage in the spring, he warmly opposed every alteration of a place which affection had established as perfect with him. "What?" he exclaimed. "Improve this dear cottage? No, that I will never consent to. Not a stone must be added to its walls, not an inch to its size, if my feelings are regarded." "Do not be alarmed," said Miss Dashwood. "Nothing of the kind will be done, for my mother will never have money to attempt it." "I'm heartily glad of it," he cried. "May she always be poor if she can employ her riches no better." "Thank you, Willoughby. But you may be assured that I would not sacrifice one sentiment of local attachment of yours, or of anyone whom I loved, for all the improvements in the world. Depend upon it that whatever unemployed sum may remain, when I make up my accounts in the spring, I would even rather lay it uselessly by than dispose of it in a manner so painful to you. But are you really so attached to this place as to see no defect in it?" "I am," said he. "To me it is faultless, nay, more. I consider it the only form of building in which happiness is attainable, and were I rich enough, I would instantly comb down, and build it up again in the exact plan of this cottage." This passage is usually taken, I think, by readers of Sense and Sensibility as, well, generously as an example of Willoughby's sensibility, right? Ungenerously, it's taken as a moment of manipulation. This is Willoughby consciously trying to worm his way deeper into the hearts of the Dashwood women. I don't take that to be true. I do read sincerity in this page, and I think that I am susceptible to the argument that this is his passionate side, that this is his sensibility. This is the proof that he makes a romantic, if not ideal, not complimentary match for Marianne. He sees only the romance. He's moved by the enormity of his big feelings, big feelings, little guy. And he reflects those positive feelings, right? Everything that he is feeling that is good, his feelings for Marianne primarily, but also for her mother and to a lesser extent sister. And he externalizes them into the environment, right? Marianne, we'll note, is silent throughout this entire scene. Mrs. Dashwood is there conceding point after point to Willoughby, though we know from the narrative voice that she was already thinking about improving the cottage come the springtime, right? She was dissatisfied with it, and now in the span of a paragraph, he reorients her. He compels her not to change it. She effectively makes him this promise that there will be no alteration of the fabric of the building. And we might see it as a kind of metaphorized, ritualized passing of the property of the family, right? From mother to new husband. Are we talking about the negotiation of a dowry here? I mean, it doesn't seem likely that Willoughby, if he marries Marianne, would live in the cottage. There's no means by which the cottage would then pass to him, right? He doesn't exist within this line of inheritance at all. It isn't clear at all what would happen to the cottage if Mrs. Dashwood were to pass. And I'm not at all sure that that reading is sufficient. I'm not at all sure that we should just read this as Brandon is gone and Willoughby is relaxed and he's having a good time and he's really enjoying the company of Marianne and he's just kind of in these big feelings and he's expressing them very forcibly, very romantically, very melodramatically even. I think we're seeing something more complex happening here, and it's related to that aforementioned introduction of friction, right? This air gap between what Willoughby and Marianne appear to be and what they really are right now, which is to say, they appear to be very much together, but they are not, in fact, very much together. And I see this as a metaphor, right? At the end of this entire exchange, Willoughby positions Marianne and the cottage not even as a paired set, but as kind of being the same thing. He says, quote, "Tell me that not only your house will remain the same, but I shall ever find you and yours as unchanged as your dwelling." He wants this, not just this building, right, which he claims to find such beauty and comfort within, not just the building, but the inhabitants of the building. He wants them fixed. He wants them stuck right here in time, unchanging. And I take that conclusion to be one that we might extend. Given how often the text is drawing the similarity between Marianne and Willoughby, kind of echoing each other, kind of finding within each other fellow feeling, we might well extend that conclusion to demonstrate that he is also deciding to accept himself as he is and to accept Marianne as she is. That this is actually what... The cottage is a metaphor. The unchanging cottage is a metaphor for the unchanging Marianne is kind of the point that I'm trying to get to. And by extension, the unchanging Willoughby too. That he does not want to see Marianne grow and improve. He doesn't want to see her become the person that she has the potential to be. A major theme of the book, though it is a theme of the book that has only been passingly introduced at this point. He wants her stuck in this one place, in this one form, ever unchanging, just as the cottage is, and by extension, wants the same grace himself. He doesn't want to bring himself up to code, right? He doesn't want to do the necessary work to improve himself alongside her. And I think that well, let me frame this out a little bit. If this is true, then it is blinkered, it is ignorant, it is lacking self-awareness, but it also does seem to be coming from, I would hesitate to say a good place, but I will say an authentic place. I do think that this is an authentic expression of desire, of love, that Willoughby wants this life that he has stumbled into, that he probably doesn't deserve and ultimately doesn't even really want, as we will see later, right? He doesn't want this cottage, flawed but cozy. This is not the home that he has set his sights on. And Marianne will be improved. Marianne, in the course of the book, spoilers, will become a fuller, better, happier version of herself. She will not be trapped by the limits of Willoughby's ambition and imagination. She will have no more dark stairway, no more kitchen that smokes. I want to develop this idea a little more as we continue to talk our way through this book, but right now I'm very powerfully struck by it. Galadriel Becky says, I read Willoughby as not sincere in his emotional expression, but given ridiculous, superficial, exaggerated compliments. Absolutely a valid read of the text, Galadriel Becky. I can't really refute that. It all depends on how it strikes you right there on the page. I think that you could definitely perform it the one way. I mean, that's so gross, right? If you're right, what we're getting is a guy who is just doing performance theater for the benefit of his mother-in-law, right? He's just kind of gratifying himself. He's satirizing these people in their poor, lamentable house. That's one of the things that kind of makes me hesitate on that read, is that we know that Willoughby's condition is not much better, if it is better at all, than the Dashwoods' condition right now, their place in society, right? And Skeep is saying here, he wants to go off and be a playboy and come back to things just how he left them. He's afraid she won't love him if he changes, and also doesn't believe that he can change. I would be inclined to read it much more as the latter than the former. I think that, I think that we can develop something here, right? I think that now is perhaps not the time to try and develop this thought, but I wonder to what degree we can enfold within this spectrum of sense and sensibility, within this spectrum of the rational and the emotional, within the spectrum of the prudent and the spontaneous, to what degree we can fold in ideas of change and changelessness. Where does Willoughby... Well, you know what, though? It's not change and changelessness, is it? I don't think that is actually the spectrum that we're pinning down here. I think what it is consequence. is how we can anticipate, whether we reckon with possible consequence rationally, or whether we want to deny the existence of consequence because that allows us and empowers us to charge headlong down a hill in the rain and crash to the ground right by our garden gate, right? Like, that is a liberative experience, but it's not necessarily a prudent experience. Sometimes we don't want to deal with the consequences of our actions. All of these ideas are going to be buzzing around for the rest of our discussion of this book. I have to draw this episode to a close. As you can hear, I think I've done 5 podcasts in 5 days, and my voice is now just a little rattled. Luckily, I get a couple days off before I actively have to record anything else. I'm going to have a couple days of writing to prepare for the next episode of Shire Reckoning. But I think that we shall draw it to a close there. Let me call up here. I did pull the rest of the end of that chapter. We will probably start with the end of that chapter next week. I think when we're... I think when we're talking about the wrap up there, when he has this moment of realizing that when he last came to stay at Allenham, he had looked upon Barton Cottage and had wished so fervently that it were in use for the beauty of the building, right? This is the story that he's telling. And then he had no idea that when he returned to the country, the very first thing that he would be told is that the Barton Cottage is absolutely in use now. And not just in use by just anyone, but by this woman who has so enchanted him, so bewitched him, matches him so well. And he pauses in that moment to look at Marianne and say, that's something, right? Like, that's magic happening right there. That's a moment of prophecy right there, isn't it? We might circle back to that and study it just a little more at the beginning of next week's session. Otherwise, let me put up this this needlessly complicated slide in order to look at what we're going to study next. Next week, August the 21st, 9 p.m. Central Time, we are going to look at Volume 1, Chapter 15 to Volume 2, Chapter 5, or if you are reading a book that is lacking both the volume distinctions and the Roman numerals, we're going to be looking from Chapter 15 to Chapter 27. That is going to carry us. What is the end of Chapter 27? Oh, that's Brandon visiting with Elinor in London. This ends with Brandon telling Elinor that he hopes that Willoughby endeavors to deserve Marianne, which is such a romantic and beautiful moment. So next week, chapters Volume 1, 15 to Volume 2, 5, or chapters 15 to 27, depending on your edition. Then the following week, Volume 2, Chapter 6 to the end of Volume 2. That is chapters 28 to 36. Inclusive. That will take us to the end of Volume 2. So I'm still hopeful that we're going to do the rest of this in 4 weeks, but we will see how that works out. Glad Rebecca's telling me here in the chat, Glorfin David and I noticed that your sessions often cut off short at the very end, so we missed your last comments. Well, that's a terrible thing. I know the podcast editions go out live, but the live broadcast infrastructure here, let me turn that down. The live broadcast infrastructure is, as I have said before, composed mainly of popsicle sticks and Elmer's glue. It is a complicated series of systems that love to fail. And we just have to be mindful of that. What I will do from here on out is, thank you for letting me know. Firstly, glad Rebecca, I appreciate that a great deal. What I will do is, rather than a somewhat indecorous dismount, I will put up the title page and I'll let it run for an extra 30 seconds, just so the actual live broadcast component of the evening will play through, and then you can turn it off whenever you see the title card reappear. I think that's how we'll do it from here. Elizabeth's saying that yours doesn't have volume. It's just a never-ending cycle of problems and catastrophes, ladies and gentlemen. We'll continue, as ever, to improve things here. If you would like to tell me your thoughts on the possibility of bonus episodes and how you would like to engage with those bonus episodes, what form you would like those bonus episodes to take, you can email me directly. I'll also put something up over on the Patreon page. We can talk about something, hopefully within the next couple of weeks. I'd like to get that started. Probably not the 1995 movie. I think we should save that for the end. I think if there's something else that we want to cover first, we'll maybe take care of that initially, and then we'll see where we end up. That is going to do it. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you all so much for your support. Patreon.com/nextword to help me buy more computer to make this all work better. That's really just like, it's the one-to-one linear relationship. Dollars equals podcasts. That's how the whole thing works. I thank you all so much for your very generous and touching support. That's going to do it for this week's encounter with Sense and Sensibility. I'll be back next week with more. Until then, take care. Good night all.